Ethan Carter stood in the shadow of Apex Solutions' sleek glass tower, its reflective panels shimmering under the morning sun. A sea of bustling professionals swarmed around him, each seeming to move with unshakable purpose. Ethan tightened his grip on the strap of his briefcase, his fingers brushing the leather as if seeking comfort. "This is it," he murmured to himself, inhaling deeply. The air carried a faint whiff of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the exhaust of taxis pulling to the curb. Everything about this place screamed power, ambition, and exclusivity. Ethan had spent years preparing for this moment, countless late nights, meticulous networking, and excelling academically. He'd earned this internship fair and square, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing unease in his gut. It wasn't just the intimidating grandeur of the corporate world that made his chest tighten. It was the knowledge of what he represented to this space, an outsider. He adjusted his tie and stepped through the revolving doors, his polished shoes clicking against the pristine marble floors of the lobby. A receptionist with a practiced smile directed him to the elevators. And within minutes, Ethan was ascending to the 25th floor. "Remember why you're here," he whispered, a mantra he had repeated endlessly since receiving the acceptance letter. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, modern office buzzing with activity. Glass partitions enclosed meeting rooms filled with smartly dressed professionals engaged in animated discussions. Rows of desks lined the open floor, each a carefully curated workspace adorned with laptops, documents, and personal mementos. The hum of productivity was palpable. Ethan stepped out, taking in the scene, when his gaze landed on a man standing in the center of the office. Jonathan Miles, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and a tailored navy suit. The regional manager exuded an air of authority. His sharp blue eyes swept over Ethan like a scanner, pausing just long enough to make him feel the weight of the scrutiny. Jonathan strode forward, his polished leather shoes striking the floor with deliberate precision. "Ethan Carter?" he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to make nearby employees glance their way. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, extending a hand. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the outstretched hand but made no move to shake it. Instead, he crossed his arms, his lips curling into a smirk. Well, another one of those diversity hires. Huh?" His tone was casual, almost conversational, but the sting of his words hit like a slap. Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned by the blatant remark. "Excuse me?" Jonathan chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. "Don't worry about it, kid, it's nothing personal. Corporate's all about optics these days. They probably figured they needed someone like you around to check a box." Ethan's chest tightened, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But he forced himself to remain calm. He'd encountered men like Jonathan before, men who assumed his accomplishments were handed to him rather than earned. He wouldn't give Jonathan the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. "I'm here because I worked for it," Ethan said evenly, meeting Jonathan's gaze. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, the smirk never leaving his face. "Sure you did," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's see if you can keep up." Without another word, Jonathan turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone amidst a sea of curious glances. A few nearby employees exchanged looks before quickly turning back to their work. Ethan exhaled slowly, unclenching his fists. This was just the beginning, he reminded himself. He wouldn't let a man like Jonathan define his experience here. Ethan's first day was a whirlwind of introductions, tasks, and barely concealed microaggressions. Jonathan made no effort to hide his disdain, assigning Ethan the most mundane and laborious tasks while offering little guidance. Whenever Ethan completed a task, Jonathan would find a flaw, real or imagined, and deliver criticism with a smug grin. By mid-afternoon, Ethan found himself at a small, cramped cubicle tucked away in the corner of the office. The desk was bare, save for a clunky desktop computer and a stack of outdated reference materials. Not exactly the corner office. "Huh?" Jonathan remarked, leaning against the cubicle wall with an exaggerated grin. "But hey, you've got to start somewhere. Let's see if you can handle it without slowing the rest of us down." Ethan gave a tight-lipped smile. "I'll do my best." Jonathan chuckled. "We'll see about that. Don't get too comfortable." Ethan watched as Jonathan sauntered away, the sound of his laughter fading into the hum of the office. Despite the relentless stream of passive-aggressive comments, Ethan buried himself in his work, determined to prove his worth. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't about to back down. As the day wound down, Ethan packed up his things and headed for the elevator. His shoulders ached from tension, but his resolve was unshaken. He had survived his first day at Apex Solutions, and he wasn't going to let Jonathan Miles, or anyone else, drive him out. "This is just the beginning," Ethan muttered to himself as the elevator doors closed. "I've got this." Ethan Carter arrived at the office early the next morning, hoping to get a head start on the tasks Jonathan Miles had dumped on him the day before. The air in the office was still, the usual hum of activity yet to begin. He appreciated the calm. It gave him time to breathe and focus before the storm hit. He found his cubicle just as he'd left it, a stark, impersonal corner of the bustling floor. Booting up his computer, he pulled out his notes and began sifting through the list of revisions Jonathan had demanded. He double-checked his work, meticulously ensuring that every detail was accurate. By the time the office began to stir, Ethan was already neck-deep in his assignments. He barely noticed the steady influx of employees until a voice interrupted his focus. "Burning the midnight oil already?" The voice was light, teasing. Ethan glanced up to see a woman about his age standing beside his cubicle. She had dark brown hair tied in a neat bun, sharp green eyes, and a warm smile. Her tailored blazer and pencil skirt exuded professionalism, but her demeanor was refreshingly approachable. "Something like that," Ethan replied with a faint smile, grateful for the reprieve from his work. "Just trying to stay ahead." "I'm Sophia Bennett," she said, extending a hand. "Marketing team." "Ethan Carter, intern," he replied, shaking her hand. "I figured. Jonathan's been making quite the spectacle of himself since you got here," Sophia said, her smile faltering slightly. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by her candor. "What type is that?" Sophia glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "The kind who likes to remind everyone he's in charge, especially when he feels threatened." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's not as untouchable as he likes to think, though." Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. He appreciated her insight, but he wasn't ready to confide in someone he had just met. "Good to know." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "If you ever need someone to talk to, or just vent about the nonsense, I'm usually around. And for what it's worth, you're handling him better than most." Ethan gave her a small smile. "Thanks, Sophia. I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe not everyone in the office saw him the way Jonathan did. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The day progressed as expected. Jonathan's presence loomed over Ethan like a storm cloud. The man had a knack for appearing just when Ethan thought he was making progress, offering cutting remarks disguised as feedback. "You call this a report?" Jonathan said, dropping a stack of papers onto Ethan's desk with a dramatic sigh. "I asked for concise analysis, not a dissertation." Ethan looked at the report, suppressing the urge to roll his eyes. "I'll revise it." "You'll need to," Jonathan said, leaning against the cubicle wall. "This kind of sloppiness won't cut it here. I've seen interns crumble under less." Ethan clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "I'll make sure it's up to your standards." Jonathan smirked, clearly enjoying the perceived power dynamic. "See that you do." As the hours dragged on, Ethan worked tirelessly, revising and refining his reports to Jonathan's exacting, often contradictory, standards. Despite the frustration, he refused to let Jonathan's criticisms undermine him. Each piece of work he submitted was better than the last, a testament to his resilience and determination. By late afternoon, the office was buzzing with anticipation for an upcoming client presentation. It was a major project that had the entire team on edge, and Ethan's workload had doubled as a result. He was tasked with preparing a detailed analysis of the company's recent performance metrics, a task Jonathan made clear was critical. "Don't mess this up, Carter," Jonathan said, hovering over Ethan's shoulder as he worked. "The last thing we need is for you to embarrass us in front of the clients." "I understand," Ethan replied, keeping his tone neutral. Jonathan's smirk widened. "Good. Remember, we've got plenty of eyes on us. Some of us more than others." Ethan's hands tightened around his keyboard, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with worse than Jonathan before. He wasn't about to let the man derail him now. As the day wound down, Ethan finished the analysis and printed the report, double-checking every detail before handing it to Jonathan. The older man flipped through the pages with a perfunctory glance before nodding reluctantly. "Not bad," Jonathan muttered, his tone begrudging. "I guess you're not completely useless after all." Ethan bit back a retort, knowing it wouldn't do any good. "I'll take that as a compliment." Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't let it go to your head, Carter. You've still got a long way to go." Ethan watched as Jonathan walked away, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of satisfaction. He had done the work. And he had done it well, despite Jonathan's constant attempts to sabotage him. As he packed up for the evening, Ethan thought about Sophia's words earlier that day. Maybe Jonathan wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was stronger than Jonathan gave him credit for. "This isn't over," Ethan whispered to himself as he stepped into the elevator. Not by a long shot. The buzz in the Apex Solutions office was electric the next morning. The upcoming client presentation was now less than a day away, and the team was scrambling to ensure everything was perfect. Ethan Carter arrived early once again, his determination to stay ahead pushing him to clock in long before most of his coworkers. As he settled into his desk, a notification pinged on his screen. An email from Jonathan Miles. "Urgent revisions needed. Ethan, review the attached metrics and rewrite the analysis. I don't want to have to go through this twice. Finish it before lunch. Jonathan." Ethan sighed, opening the attachment. As expected, the requested changes were both minor and unnecessarily nitpicky. It was clear Jonathan was making busywork just to test him, or worse, to set him up for failure. Nevertheless, Ethan rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He had no intention of letting Jonathan win this game. By mid-morning, the tension in the office was palpable. Employees rushed back and forth, clutching documents and laptops, their voices hushed but urgent. Ethan was deeply immersed in his revisions when he heard the familiar sound of Jonathan's voice cutting through the din. "Carter," Jonathan barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Ethan looked up to see Jonathan striding toward his cubicle, a folder in hand and a sneer plastered on his face. The man stopped just short of Ethan's desk, tossing the folder onto it with a dramatic flourish. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, tapping the folder with his finger. Ethan opened it and scanned the contents. It was a draft he had completed earlier in the week, one Jonathan had barely glanced at before dismissing it as adequate. "It's the data analysis you asked for," Ethan replied evenly. Jonathan scoffed. "This is sloppy. You didn't follow the structure I outlined." Ethan furrowed his brow, flipping through the pages. He had followed Jonathan's instructions to the letter. "I reviewed the outline you gave me," Ethan said, keeping his voice measured. "If there's an issue, I can adjust it." Jonathan leaned in, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Don't play games with me, Carter. You're here to learn, not to argue." Ethan met his gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "I'm not arguing. I'll revise it." Jonathan straightened, clearly irritated by Ethan's calm demeanor. "See that you do," he snapped before storming off. As Ethan returned to his work, he caught a glimpse of Sophia Bennett watching from across the room. She gave him a sympathetic smile, which he returned with a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in this. By lunchtime, Ethan had completed the revisions and delivered them to Jonathan's desk. He was about to return to his cubicle when he overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. "So, you think you've got the promotion locked down?" one of the senior employees asked Jonathan, their voices carrying from a nearby meeting room. "Of course," Jonathan replied with a laugh. "The CEO loves my numbers. This client presentation is just a formality. Once it's over, I'll be sitting pretty in the corner office." Ethan clenched his fists. The idea of Jonathan being promoted, given the way he treated others, was almost unbearable, but he quickly reminded himself that nothing was guaranteed. He just had to keep his head down and stay focused. The rest of the day passed in a blur of revisions, last-minute tweaks, and mounting tension. As the office began to empty out for the evening, Ethan stayed behind, determined to ensure his work was flawless. He was deep in concentration when Sophia appeared at his desk. "You okay?" she asked, leaning against the cubicle wall. Ethan glanced up, surprised to see her still there. Yeah, just finishing up. Sophia crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. You know, I've seen Jonathan pull this kind of thing before. He pushes people until they snap, just so he can say they weren't cut out for the job. Ethan nodded. I figured as much. Sophia hesitated, then added, You're doing a great job. Ethan, don't let him get to you. Her words were sincere, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of encouragement. Thanks, Sophia, I'll try. As she walked away, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He knew Jonathan was gunning for him, but he also knew he had the skills and determination to succeed. The question was how long he could endure Jonathan's relentless attempts to tear him down. The next morning, the day of the client presentation, Ethan arrived even earlier than usual. The office was quiet, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Ethan reviewed his work one final time, double-checking every figure and calculation. By the time the meeting began, the conference room was filled with senior executives, including Jonathan and the CEO, Richard Carter. Ethan took a seat near the back, silently observing as Jonathan led the presentation. It started smoothly enough, with Jonathan confidently outlining the company's achievements. But when a client asked a technical question about the data, Jonathan faltered. His polished exterior cracked as he stumbled over his response, his frustration becoming evident. Ethan saw his opportunity. Standing up, he addressed the client directly. I can explain that. All eyes turned to him. The room falling silent, Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. He walked the client through the data with precision and clarity, answering their questions with ease. When he finished, the client nodded, clearly impressed. The room erupted into polite applause, though Jonathan's expression was anything but pleased. Good job, Carter, Jonathan said through gritted teeth as the meeting adjourned, but his forced smile couldn't hide the simmering anger in his eyes. Ethan returned to his desk, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He had proven himself in front of everyone, including his father, who gave him a small, approving nod as he exited the conference room. That evening, as Ethan packed up to leave, he felt a newfound sense of confidence. He had weathered Jonathan's storm and come out stronger for it. But he also knew this was only the beginning. Jonathan wasn't finished with him, not yet. But Ethan was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Ethan Carter walked into the office with his head held high. The previous day's client presentation had been a turning point. He'd proven not only to himself but to everyone in that room, including Jonathan Miles, that he belonged at Apex Solutions. But as he settled into his desk, the quiet satisfaction of his success was quickly overshadowed by the storm brewing in Jonathan's corner. From the moment Jonathan arrived, it was clear he wasn't taking Ethan's victory lightly. Jonathan stormed through the office like a man on a mission, his face twisted into an expression of barely contained anger. He stopped at Ethan's cubicle, slamming a stack of folders onto his desk. Carter, Jonathan barked, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. Since you're so eager to prove yourself, I've got a new assignment for you. Ethan looked up, keeping his expression neutral. What's the task? Jonathan sneered. I need these reports analyzed, cross-referenced with the quarterly projections, and formatted into a client-ready presentation. By end of day, Ethan flipped through the folders. The amount of work was staggering, easily a 2-day task. End of day? He repeated, raising an eyebrow. This is a lot to get through in a few hours. Jonathan leaned in, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. I thought you wanted to show everyone you're up for the challenge. Or is that too much for you? Ethan met his gaze, refusing to rise to the bait. I'll get it done. Jonathan straightened, his smirk returning. Good, let's see if you can keep up. As Jonathan walked away, Ethan exhaled slowly, already strategizing how to tackle the mountain of work. He couldn't let Jonathan win, not now. As Ethan worked, the hours flew by. He barely noticed when Sophia Bennett appeared at his desk, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. You look like you could use this, she said, placing one in front of him. Ethan blinked, surprised but grateful. Thanks, you didn't have to. Sophia smiled, pulling up a chair. You're right, I didn't, but I know how Jonathan operates. He dumped this on you, didn't he? Ethan nodded, glancing at the pile of folders. End of day deadline, no pressure. Sophia rolled her eyes. Typical. He's been pulling this stunt for years. You're not the first intern he's tried to crush. Ethan frowned. And no one's called him out on it? Not publicly, Sophia said with a shrug. But people notice. Trust me, they're watching. Ethan took a sip of the coffee, the warmth grounding him. Thanks, Sophia. Really? She waved him off. Just don't let him get to you. You're doing great. Her words bolstered his spirits. And as she returned to her desk, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was proving that people like Jonathan couldn't hold others down forever. As the day progressed, Jonathan's tactics became more blatant. At one point, he called a team meeting, pulling Ethan away from his work just as he was hitting his stride. Carter, Jonathan said as the team gathered in the conference room, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. Why don't you tell us how you're handling your new assignment? Ethan straightened, refusing to show any discomfort. I'm making good progress. I should have it ready by the deadline. Jonathan smirked. We'll see. Deadlines here aren't just suggestions. You know. Several of the other employees exchanged glances. Their unease palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of their silent judgment. But he focused on keeping his composure. After the meeting, as Ethan rushed back to his desk, he discovered an email from Jonathan. The subject line read, Revised Instructions. Opening it, Ethan's heart sank. Jonathan had completely changed the requirements for the report, just hours before the deadline. Ethan clenched his fists, the frustration threatening to overwhelm him. But instead of reacting, he took a deep breath and began recalibrating. If Jonathan thought he could push Ethan to the breaking point, he was wrong. As Ethan worked late into the evening, the office gradually emptied out. He was so focused that he didn't notice Emma Sinclair, the HR manager, standing nearby until she cleared her throat. Long day? She asked. Her tone gentle. Ethan nodded, glancing up. Something like that. Emma studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. I've noticed how Jonathan's been treating you. Ethan stiffened but said nothing, unsure of how much to reveal. You don't have to say anything. Emma continued, but if you ever need to talk, my door's open. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Thanks, I appreciate that. As Emma walked away, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure if she could help, but knowing someone else saw what was happening gave him strength. By the time Ethan finally finished the revised report, the office was nearly empty. He printed it out and placed it on Jonathan's desk, the satisfaction of completing the task outweighing his exhaustion. As he packed up his things, Sophia appeared again, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. You made it. Ethan smiled faintly. Barely. She nodded toward Jonathan's empty desk. He'll push harder now. You know. I know, Ethan said, but I'm ready. Sophia smiled. Good, because you're not alone in this. Ethan watched her walk away, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time since he started at Apex Solutions, he felt like he had allies, people who saw him for who he truly was. Not just the caricature Jonathan tried to paint. As he stepped into the elevator, Ethan allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He had survived another day, and he wasn't going anywhere. The atmosphere in the Apex Solutions office had shifted subtly over the past few days. Ethan Carter could feel it, a growing awareness among his coworkers. A sense that Jonathan Miles's behavior was starting to attract attention. While Jonathan continued his campaign of sabotage and condescension, Ethan noticed more and more quiet glances exchanged in the hallways. Murmurs that ceased as he approached. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Ethan hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was starting to make an impact. Jonathan's escalation. On a chilly Wednesday morning, Ethan arrived at his desk to find a stack of papers waiting for him, along with a terse note from Jonathan. Carter, I expect these numbers updated by noon. Don't disappoint. Jonathan. Ethan sat down, flipping through the documents. It was another impossible task, designed to overwhelm him and set him up for failure. He sighed, rubbing his temples before diving in. If Jonathan thought he could break him, he was sorely mistaken. By mid-morning, Jonathan appeared at Ethan's cubicle, his arms crossed and his signature smirk in place. How's it coming, Carter? He asked, his tone oozing false concern. Ethan didn't look up from his screen. It's under control. Jonathan chuckled. We'll see about that. Remember, you're not just representing yourself. If you mess this up, it reflects on the whole team. Ethan glanced up, meeting Jonathan's gaze with calm resolve. I'm aware. For a moment, Jonathan's smirk faltered, as though he hadn't expected Ethan to respond so directly. He straightened, clearing his throat. Good, keep it that way. As Jonathan walked away, Ethan returned to his work, determined to finish the task ahead of schedule. He wasn't just going to meet the deadline, he was going to exceed it. As noon approached, Sophia Bennett stopped by Ethan's desk, holding a sandwich and a bottle of water. Figured you might need this, she said, setting the items down with a smile. Ethan looked up, startled. Thanks, but you didn't have to. Don't argue, Sophia said, cutting him off. I've seen Jonathan hovering like a vulture all morning. You need fuel if you're going to keep up with his nonsense. Ethan chuckled despite himself. Fair point. Sophia leaned against the cubicle wall, her expression softening. You're doing great. You know, most people would have cracked by now. Ethan shrugged. I don't have the luxury of cracking. Sophia tilted her head, studying him. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Ethan smiled faintly. Thanks, Sophia. That means a lot. As she walked away, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was proving to the people who believed in him that their support wasn't misplaced. That afternoon, the tension in the office reached a breaking point. During a team meeting, Jonathan launched into a tirade about the importance of professionalism and accountability, his gaze frequently darting toward Ethan. Some people, Jonathan said, his voice loud and condescending, seem to think they can coast through this internship without putting in the effort. But let me be clear. Mediocrity won't be tolerated here. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening. The thinly veiled insult hung in the air, and he could feel the eyes of his coworkers on him. Sophia, seated across from Ethan, spoke up. I don't think anyone here is coasting, Jonathan. In fact, I've seen a lot of people putting in extra hours lately. Jonathan's smirk froze, his gaze snapping to Sophia. Of course, I wasn't referring to anyone specific. Good, Sophia said, her tone cool, because we all know how hard everyone's working. The tension in the room was palpable as Jonathan struggled to recover. Ethan glanced at Sophia, silently grateful for her intervention. Later that day, as Ethan was finishing up his work, Emma Sinclair, the HR manager, stopped by his desk. Ethan, she said, her voice calm but firm. Do you have a moment? Ethan nodded, standing to follow her into her office. Once inside, Emma closed the door and gestured for him to sit. I've been monitoring the situation with Jonathan, Emma began, folding her hands on the desk. I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. Ethan's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. I appreciate that. Emma studied him for a moment before continuing. I understand that you've been dealing with challenges. If there's anything you want to document, now is the time. Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to lay everything out, the insults, the impossible deadlines, the constant undermining, but he also didn't want to come across as complaining. I'll think about it, he said finally. Emma nodded, her expression kind. Just know that we're here to support you. And you're not alone in this. Ethan left her office feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The walls were starting to close in on Jonathan. But the battle wasn't over yet. As the day wound down, Jonathan stopped by Ethan's desk one last time, his smirk replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Carter, he said, his voice low, I hope you're not getting too comfortable. This is a competitive environment. And not everyone makes it. Ethan met his gaze steadily. I'm aware. Jonathan leaned in, his tone dripping with malice. Good, because I'm not going to make this easy for you. Ethan smiled faintly, his confidence unwavering. You haven't so far. For the first time, Jonathan looked genuinely rattled. He straightened, muttering something under his breath before walking away. Ethan watched him go, a sense of quiet triumph settling over him. The tide was turning, and he could feel it. Jonathan's reign of terror was beginning to crumble, and Ethan was ready to see it through to the end. The next morning at Apex Solutions, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Ethan Carter had become a quiet force in the office, his unwavering composure and consistent performance catching the attention of more than just Jonathan Miles. Whispers followed him through the hallways, not of doubt but of admiration. People were starting to notice the cracks forming in Jonathan's facade, and they were paying attention. As Ethan walked into the office, he was greeted by Sophia Bennett, who handed him a coffee without a word. The gesture had become a small ritual between them. a silent acknowledgement of the battles he faced daily. "Thanks," Ethan said, taking the cup with a smile. Sophia leaned against his cubicle wall. "Word around the office is that Jonathan's been getting some pushback. Emma's been asking questions, and I think a few others are finally seeing him for what he is." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Sophia nodded. "People are starting to speak up, quietly. But it's happening. You've got more allies than you think." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, the warmth bolstering his resolve. "Good to know. Thanks, Sophia." She gave him a wink before heading back to her desk, leaving Ethan with a renewed sense of hope. The tide was turning, and for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Later that day, Jonathan called another team meeting. His attempts to reassert control were becoming more desperate, his tone more brittle. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, his eyes darting from one employee to another as if daring them to challenge him. "We've got another major client presentation next week," Jonathan announced, his voice tight. "I'll be overseeing the preparation personally. And I expect nothing less than perfection." Ethan sat quietly, taking notes, but he could feel Jonathan's eyes on him. "Carter," Jonathan said suddenly, his tone sharp, "you'll be handling the preliminary analysis. Make sure it's flawless." Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. "Understood." Jonathan sneered. "Good. I'd hate to have to clean up another one of your mistakes." Sophia's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I haven't seen Ethan make any mistakes, Jonathan. In fact, his last analysis saved the client presentation." The room fell silent. Jonathan's smirk faltered, and he shot Sophia a glare. "That's not the point, Bennett, isn't it?" Sophia replied coolly. "If the work is good, it's good." A murmur rippled through the room, and Jonathan's face reddened. "We'll see if Carter can maintain that standard," he snapped before abruptly ending the meeting. As the team filed out, Sophia shot Ethan a conspiratorial smile. He nodded subtly, grateful for her support. That afternoon, Emma Sinclair approached Ethan's desk once again. She carried a folder and a calm but purposeful expression. "Ethan, can I see you in my office for a moment?" she asked. Ethan followed her, his mind racing. Inside her office, Emma gestured for him to sit before closing the door. "I wanted to share something with you," Emma began, sliding the folder across the desk. "These are written statements from several employees about Jonathan's behavior." Ethan opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. Each statement detailed incidents of bullying, micromanagement, and discriminatory remarks, many of them eerily similar to what he had experienced. Emma leaned forward, her expression serious. "We're building a case against Jonathan. His behavior has gone unchecked for too long. But we need your voice to strengthen it." Ethan hesitated. He had worked so hard to stay above the fray, to let his work speak for itself. But now, faced with tangible evidence that others had suffered as he had, he knew he couldn't stay silent. "I'll do it," Ethan said finally. "I'll add my statement." Emma's expression softened. "Thank you, Ethan. This could make all the difference." As the week progressed, Jonathan's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was no longer the untouchable figure he once appeared to be. His frustration boiled over in meetings, and his thinly veiled jabs at Ethan became more overt. During one particularly tense exchange, Jonathan slammed a stack of papers onto Ethan's desk. "You call this a report?" Jonathan snarled. "It's amateur work at best." Ethan looked up calmly. "The numbers are accurate, and the analysis aligns with the objectives you outlined." Jonathan's face darkened. "Don't talk back to me, Carter. I know what I'm looking at." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "If there's something specific you'd like me to adjust, I'll fix it." For a moment, Jonathan seemed at a loss for words. The usual smugness was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Without another word, he stalked off, leaving Ethan to his work. By the end of the week, the whispers in the office had grown louder. More employees were stepping forward to share their experiences with Emma, and the momentum against Jonathan was building. Sophia stopped by Ethan's desk as he packed up for the day. "You've got him on the ropes," she said with a grin. Ethan shook his head. "It's not just me, it's everyone he's treated like this." "True," Sophia said, her expression softening, "but you've been the catalyst. People are standing up because they see you holding your ground." Ethan smiled, a sense of quiet pride washing over him. "Thanks, Sophia." As he walked out of the office that evening, Ethan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Jonathan Miles's days of unchecked power were numbered, and Ethan knew he was ready for whatever came next. The atmosphere at Apex Solutions was electric as the week drew to a close. Jonathan Miles, once a seemingly untouchable figure in the office, was visibly unraveling. His tone had grown sharper, his commands more erratic, but beneath his bravado, there was a flicker of unease, a realization that his control over the team was slipping. For Ethan Carter, the shift in the office dynamic was palpable. Coworkers who had once avoided him now offered quiet nods of encouragement. And even the occasional whispered, "Good job," made its way to his desk. Ethan wasn't alone anymore, and he knew it. It was Friday morning when the tension finally reached its boiling point. The team was gathered in the conference room for a status meeting. Jonathan, standing at the head of the table, was in rare form, his voice loud and grating as he barked instructions. "Carter," Jonathan said, pointing at Ethan like a prosecutor in court. "Where's the revised client strategy I asked for?" Ethan met Jonathan's gaze calmly. "I submitted it yesterday. It's in your inbox." Jonathan's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Then why haven't I seen it? Are you trying to sabotage this project?" The accusation hung in the air, drawing sharp glances from around the table. For the first time, Ethan saw coworkers exchanging looks of disbelief, not at him, but at Jonathan. "I emailed it to you yesterday afternoon," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I can pull it up now if you'd like." Jonathan's face reddened, his composure cracking. "That won't be necessary," he snapped. "Just make sure you're not cutting corners." Before Ethan could respond, Sophia Bennett spoke up from the other end of the table. "I saw Ethan working on that report all day yesterday. It's thorough." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Sophia, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Jonathan's bluster. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "This isn't about playing favorites, Bennett." "Neither is this," Sophia shot back, her voice cool. "We're just pointing out the facts." A murmur rippled through the room, and Jonathan's expression darkened. He straightened, gripping the edge of the table as though to steady himself. "Let's move on," he muttered, his voice strained. After the tense meeting, Ethan returned to his desk, his thoughts racing. He hadn't expected Sophia to step in so openly, and her words had clearly shaken Jonathan. But the day wasn't over yet. Around midday, Emma Sinclair appeared at Ethan's cubicle. "Can I see you in my office?" she asked. Ethan followed her, closing the door behind him as he entered. Emma gestured for him to sit, her expression serious. "We're nearing the end of this," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I thought you should see this." Ethan opened the folder to find a compilation of complaints against Jonathan, dozens of them, spanning years. Each one detailed instances of bullying, micromanagement, and outright discrimination. "This is a lot," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "It's been building for a long time. Your statement was the final piece we needed. I've submitted everything to Richard Carter. He's reviewing it now." Ethan's heart raced. His father, though still a distant figure in this process, was about to step in. "What happens next?" he asked. Emma's expression softened. "That depends on how Jonathan handles what's coming." Late that afternoon, an email from Richard Carter's assistant landed in everyone's inbox. "Team meeting at 3 p.m. All employees in Jonathan Miles's division are required to attend. Location: Conference Room A. Richard Carter's office." The message sent a ripple of curiosity through the office. As the time approached, employees filed into the conference room, their expressions a mix of confusion and anticipation. Ethan sat near the middle, Sophia by his side. At precisely 3 p.m., Richard Carter entered the room, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs. He was a tall man with a calm, measured demeanor, his sharp suit and silver tie adding to his air of authority. Emma followed closely behind him, carrying a stack of documents. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began, his deep voice resonating through the room. "This meeting is to address a serious matter concerning the leadership in this division." Jonathan, seated at the head of the table, stiffened. His eyes darted to Richard, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread. Richard turned his gaze to Jonathan, his voice steady but firm. "Over the past few months, I've been reviewing multiple complaints regarding your behavior as a manager. These complaints span years and come from numerous employees." Jonathan's face turned pale. I don't understand. He stammered. What complaints? Emma stepped forward, placing the stack of documents on the table. These, she said simply. The room was silent as Jonathan picked up the first document. His hands trembling, his eyes widened as he skimmed the pages. And he quickly set it down, unable to meet Richard's gaze. I've built this company on the principles of respect, accountability, and excellence. Richard continued. Your actions have violated those principles. Effective immediately. You are relieved of your duties at Apex Solutions. Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous, he shouted. You can't do this. I've given everything to this company. And in return, Richard said, his voice cold, you've abused your power and undermined the trust of your team. Your time here is over. Jonathan looked around the room, his eyes wild as if searching for an ally. But no one met his gaze. Even those who had once sided with him now sat in silence, unwilling to defend him. Finally, Jonathan turned to Ethan, his face twisted with rage. You, he hissed. This is all your fault. Ethan met his glare calmly. You did this to yourself. Jonathan opened his mouth to retort, but Richard cut him off. That's enough. Security will escort you out. 2 guards appeared at the door, and Jonathan, defeated, allowed himself to be led away. The door closed behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached Ethan, his expression unreadable. A word, Ethan? Ethan nodded, following his father into a smaller conference room. Once inside, Richard turned to face him. You handled yourself well, Richard said, his tone softening. I know this hasn't been easy. Ethan met his father's gaze. I just wanted to prove that I belonged here. You've done more than that, Richard replied. You've shown resilience and integrity, qualities this company needs. Ethan nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Thank you. Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. This is just the beginning. I'm proud of you. As they left the room, Ethan felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. Jonathan Miles was gone, and the path ahead was finally clear. The battle was over, but Ethan's journey was just beginning. The following Monday, the Apex Solutions office was nearly unrecognizable. The absence of Jonathan Miles had lifted a weight from the entire team. And the air was noticeably lighter. Conversations were no longer hushed or tense. And there was a newfound energy in the workspace. For the first time since Ethan Carter had joined the company, he felt what it was like to work without the oppressive shadow of Jonathan looming over him. Ethan arrived at his desk early, as usual, to find a message from Emma Sinclair waiting in his inbox. Acknowledgement of contribution. Ethan, your resilience and professionalism throughout the recent challenges have been exemplary. Leadership has taken notice. Let's discuss your future at Apex Solutions when you have time. Best, Emma Sinclair. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. He knew he had done the right thing by stepping forward, but seeing his efforts acknowledged was a vindication he hadn't realized he needed. He quickly typed a reply, thanking Emma and setting up a meeting later that week. As Ethan worked through his tasks that morning, several coworkers stopped by his desk, offering words of encouragement. Hey, Ethan, said Lisa, a senior analyst who rarely spoke with interns. I just wanted to say I'm glad you stuck it out. A lot of us have wanted to say something about Jonathan for years. But, she trailed off, shrugging, you stood your ground. That means something. Thanks, Ethan replied, his voice warm. It wasn't easy, but I appreciate the support. Lisa smiled. Well, it's your time now. If you ever need anything, let me know. Sophia Bennett was next, her ever-present coffee cup in hand. So, Mr. Rising Star, she teased, leaning against the cubicle wall. What's next? Ethan chuckled. Honestly, I'm just trying to keep up. Well, you're doing more than that, Sophia said, her tone softening. You've earned every bit of respect you're getting now. Just don't let it go to your head. I'll do my best, Ethan replied with a grin. That afternoon, Ethan met with Emma in her office. She greeted him warmly, gesturing for him to sit as she closed the door. I'll get straight to the point, Emma began. Your handling of the situation with Jonathan has been impressive. It's rare to see someone maintain such composure under pressure. Thank you, Ethan said. I just wanted to focus on doing my job. And you did, Emma replied. But it's more than that. You've set an example for what this company should strive for: integrity, resilience, and teamwork. Ethan felt a swell of pride but kept his expression neutral. I appreciate that. Emma leaned forward, her tone turning serious. We want to offer you a full-time position here at Apex Solutions once your internship ends. You've proven yourself more than capable. And we'd be lucky to have you on board. Ethan's heart raced. A full-time position? This was more than he dared to hope for. I'd be honored, he said, his voice steady despite the excitement bubbling inside him. Emma smiled. Excellent. We'll work out the details in the coming weeks. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. As Ethan left her office, the weight of everything he'd endured felt worth it. The path ahead was clearer than ever. Toward the end of the week, Ethan received a message from his father. Richard Carter. Subject: catching up. Ethan, come by my office when you have a moment. Dad. Ethan made his way to Richard's office, his mind racing. Despite their shared moments during the fallout with Jonathan, their conversations had remained formal, focused on work. Now, it seemed, Richard wanted something more personal. Richard looked up from his desk as Ethan entered, a faint smile softening his usually serious demeanor. Close the door, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Ethan complied, sitting down as his father leaned back in his chair. How are you feeling? Richard asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. Relieved, Ethan admitted, but also ready to move forward. Richard nodded. Good, that's the attitude I hoped you'd have. They sat in silence for a moment before Richard continued. You've done more than prove yourself here. Ethan, you've shown me that you have the qualities of a leader. The way you handled Jonathan, the way you earned the respect of your peers, it's exactly what this company needs. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. His father's approval was something he'd longed for, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself. Thank you, Dad, that means a lot. Richard smiled, a rare expression that softened his stern features. You've earned it. The following weeks flew by as Ethan settled into his new role at Apex Solutions. The challenges he faced with Jonathan had prepared him for the fast-paced, high-pressure environment, and he quickly became a valued member of the team. His coworkers treated him with respect, and he found himself thriving in ways he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as he worked on a new client proposal, Sophia stopped by his desk. You know, she said, leaning against the cubicle wall. It's nice to see you smiling for a change. Ethan looked up, chuckling. I didn't realize I wasn't before. Trust me, you weren't, Sophia teased, but you've earned it. You've turned this place around more than you realize. Ethan smiled. Thanks, Sophia. I couldn't have done it without you. Sophia waved him off. Please, you've had it in you all along. As she walked away, Ethan turned back to his computer, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. The road to this moment hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And he knew this was only the beginning. As the months passed, Ethan Carter's role at Apex Solutions solidified. He had gone from being the young intern overshadowed by Jonathan Miles to a respected member of the team. His peers sought him out for advice, and his superiors took note of his ability to lead with a balance of firmness and empathy. But for Ethan, the most significant transformation was internal. He no longer felt like he needed to prove his worth to anyone. He had earned his place, and now it was time to leave his own mark. One morning, Emma Sinclair called Ethan into her office. She greeted him with her usual warm smile but quickly got down to business. We've got a new project coming up, Emma began. It's a big one, expanding into a new market. And we want you to take the lead on the proposal. Ethan blinked, surprised. Me? Lead? Emma nodded. You've shown us that you're more than capable. This is your chance to step into a leadership role. Ethan hesitated for a moment, the weight of the opportunity sinking in. But then he nodded, his resolve strengthening. I'll do it. Emma smiled. Good. I'll connect you with the team later today. Ethan dove into the project with the same determination that had carried him through the challenges of his internship. He assembled a team, which included Sophia Bennett and several senior analysts, and quickly outlined a strategy for their proposal. The work was demanding, but Ethan thrived under the pressure. His ability to delegate effectively and foster collaboration earned him the respect of his team. Even Sophia, who had always teased him about his seriousness, admitted she was impressed. You're a natural at this, she said one evening as they worked late. I'm starting to think you might be running this place someday. Ethan chuckled, but the idea planted a seed in his mind. For the first time, He could see a future at Apex Solutions, not just as a team member, but as a leader. The day of the presentation arrived, and Ethan stood before the company's board of directors, his proposal carefully laid out in a series of slides. Richard Carter sat at the head of the table, watching quietly as Ethan spoke. Ethan's voice was steady, his confidence evident as he explained the team's vision for the new market expansion. He anticipated questions and addressed them with clarity, drawing on the strengths of his team's research. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then, one of the board members nodded approvingly. "This is impressive," she said. "I think we've got a solid plan here." The rest of the board murmured their agreement, and Richard gave a small nod of approval. "Excellent work, Ethan," he said. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need." Ethan felt a surge of pride. He had come a long way from the intern struggling under Jonathan's shadow. Now, he was shaping the future of the company. In a quiet moment after the meeting, Ethan received an unexpected email from Jonathan Miles. The subject line simply read, "Apology." Ethan hesitated before opening it. The email was short but sincere. "Ethan, I've had a lot of time to think about how I treated you. I was wrong. I let my insecurities and prejudices cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. You've proven that you're more than capable. And I hope you'll continue to succeed. Jonathan." Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. The anger and resentment he had once felt for Jonathan had faded over time, replaced by a quiet understanding of how people like Jonathan were shaped by their own fears. Ethan didn't reply to the email, but he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. A year after his internship began, Ethan stood in the CEO's office once again. Richard Carter watched him with a mixture of pride and curiosity. "You've done well, Ethan," Richard said. "Better than I could have imagined." "Thanks, Dad," Ethan replied. The formality between them had softened over time, replaced by a deeper bond. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Have you thought about what's next?" Ethan nodded. "I want to keep building. Not just for myself, but for others like me. There's so much potential out there. And I want to make sure this company is a place where anyone can succeed." Richard smiled. "That's a worthy goal, and one I think you're more than ready for." Years later, Ethan Carter sat at the head of the table in the Apex Solutions boardroom. He had climbed the ranks, his journey marked by resilience, integrity, and a commitment to lifting others as he rose. The once intimidated intern was now a respected leader, shaping the company's future with a vision of inclusivity and excellence. Sophia Bennett, now a senior executive, leaned over during a meeting and whispered, "Told you you'd be running this place someday." Ethan chuckled, glancing around the room at the diverse, vibrant team he had helped build. The challenges he had faced were now lessons he carried with him, guiding him in every decision he made. As the meeting concluded, Ethan stood by the window of his corner office, looking out at the city skyline. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the obstacles, the allies, and the victories. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but he was ready, because this time, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, and the legacy he was building would last for generations.